this is about more than just Canada. This is about the political manipulations and economic gaslighting that has been happening. Hello, my name is Ken Ziegler, and this is the Not-Quite Humanoid Typhoon. And this week, if you hadn't guessed, I'm throwing my hat into the conversations pertaining to tariffs. Uh, the US government, Trump specifically, has decided that universally using tariffs as a scare tactic to mystify everyone pertaining to certain goals that he couldn't achieve his first trial around, he seems to be accomplishing far better this time around. Mainly a anti-immigration, anti-drug concept that mostly dwells in lies and misinformation. The claims pertaining to, for example, immigrants flooding the U.S. from the north, at best, is misunderstood. The flow of illegals, as they call it, isn't just from Canada into the US, it's also the US into Canada. It's a two-way street when it comes to that particular issue. We have just as many illegals coming into our country as they claim are coming into theirs from ours. And what's even worse, though, is the accusation of narcotics, where 0.2% of US fentanyl problems might be coming from Canada, where I can guarantee you well over 100 times that at least 20 to 30% of Canada's fentanyl problems are coming from the US. So, not really a fair comparison. When we turn around and say, oh, we've caught 43 pounds of fentanyl, notice how the news never admits that it wasn't going to the US when they caught it. It's coming from. But nobody wants to talk about that because it doesn't suit the narrative. This is the gaslighting. They are taking a subversion of our reality and forcing us to believe something else. And why? Why are we having to endure these political misinformations, these manipulations against our better judgments, our better goods? Is it so that he can turn Canada into the 51st state? Something that was joked about many, many times, but more he talks about it, the more it feels like he thinks he's serious. And that's a problem because could you imagine the US annexing an ally, let alone the one of the largest long lasting allies that have ever happened on this planet, you with the world's largest undefended border? What is the world coming to when we feel we have to defend ourselves from one of our biggest allies, who's now become one of our biggest bullies? When Trump sits there and makes certain arguments, especially about Canada, or he belittles us, I feel that the one good that's coming out of all this is Canada's national identity is finally starting to solidify again. There are a few occasions when Canadians were able to step up and say in one voice, we are Canadian. We are not American, and we never want to be. And I think there is a vital importance to that distinction. When an outside force becomes the threat, people unify. The subversion of the outside forces using misinformation, social media, and other type of manipulations to have us at each other's throats all the time. Well, because it wasn't plainly obvious an outside source creating these distinctions, we were always at each other's throats. But now we have to thank the US for creating an enemy that we can all physically see as the sole problem in the whole matter. And that is Donald Trump. Uh, and his sycophant brolyarchy with the tech industry leading the way with Elon Musk and Zuckerberg and Bezos. Sure, they have all that money, but it's five guys. I'm pretty confident we can take them if we really wanted to. So that's not the problem. I think part of the huge issue here, this would be something like the bystander effect is playing, because those five are getting away with just short of bloody murder. Who's the one going to step up and stop them? Because we're all hoping it'll be somebody else, because we don't want to take on that responsibility because it seems so vastly overwhelming to our particular position. This is why we have to do it as a group. It can't just be one person stepping up. It has to be all of us putting our foot down, saying no, and having the rules be established. Because a rule can't exist if no one enforces it. So, what's the point in writing them down if we don't have anybody walking up and making sure that they are playing by the same rules as the rest of us? Because they haven't for a while. And the whole tariff thing is just evidence of that. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930 almost broke the world. The Great Depression was kicking in, and the US government thought it'd be a great idea to attempt to force other countries to pay their debts that were generated in the Great War. Canada, Great Britain, France, these were allies who the US tariffed against in order to try and make back some of its losses. In reality, what ended up happening was 75% losses in imports, 80% losses in exports. The US literally lost their shirt. And the Great Depression led to the World War II, which led to the Cold War, which led to an arms race, which led to countless proxy wars. And it really came down to just the misappropriation and misunderstanding of how a tariff actually works. So let's take a second and let's establish the timeline of what tariffs really do. The tariff is not a tax. A tariff is an additional cost being tacked on to a product as it passes over a border. The country imposing the tariff is taking that money. Now, that money has to come from somewhere. No corporation wants to just give it up because their margins are already somewhat slim, because raw materials and manufacturing costs, logistics costs, these things are quite substantial. So the tariff hits. Well, that means they're going to have to pass it on to the buyer. So it is not the producer of the product that's shipping it that's going to end up paying that cost. It will be the buyer, which is the person who's going to retail it. And the retailer, of course, they need their profits. So they're going to increase the costs at that point, which means it comes down to the consumer who needs to purchase it. And so the tariffs are all end up getting paid by the consumers. So that's your step-by-step process. Now, this is essentially the way flat tax systems work, is it affects everyone indiscriminately. We all end up having to pay towards it. One of the reasons flat tax systems are very difficult in a economically disparaged country such as Canada and the US, where so few have so much compared to the rest of us, is that with the flat tax rate is it assumes that we all have the same spending power. But this has not been the truth for centuries, arguably. I don't think there's ever been a consistency in spending power. But this was the belief when Reagan created the trickle-down economics, was that those with would spend that much more so that those without would be able to pick up what's left. The thing is, those with don't spend, they hoard. They collect all of it and they end up becoming grand dragons over, piles of gold sitting there clicking their teeth. So instead of sending a knight to go slaughter the dragon, we appease it by throwing more gold at it. Sorry, I went on a bit of a rant there. Let's get back on topic. The thing with the flat taxes is that 5% for me could make or break my ability to eat at the end of the day. An extra 5% on the same amount of food to someone of wealth they don't even notice the difference because generally they don't even know how much they're paying for their food anyway. They just give somebody else the ability to shop for them. So the flat taxes don't work. Sales taxes don't work. Most importantly, tariffs will not work. They will not generate wealth for a nation because every penny a nation thinks that it could get off the tariff is actually monies that the overall economic system has lost because that much less trade is going to happen in the first place because no one's going to want to trade with a country that's attempting to take it all. A great example of that would be look what happened with Venezuela when they decided to go full socialist and they told oil industries you can invest in our country, but the second you do, we own everything you've put in there because it was up to the state to own and distribute amongst the people. So everyone stopped investing and Venezuela's economy crashed. Big surprise. So how would the tariffs work any differently? It is it, just literally to attack the mentality of the gaslighters who are imposing it. It is the ultimate form of socialist assault on the people because you're generally trying to take all that wealth and distribute it by your means of avenue instead of giving anyone the freedom of choice. Now, it may not have the term tax attached to it, so maybe that's why they think they can get away with it. But again, this is where the misinformation comes into play. They don't want you to see it as a tax. They don't want you to see it as that redistribution of wealth because it's your wealth they're redistributing, not theirs. Theirs is still secured. Theirs is still intact because they generally work in ideas, not in actual product. And an idea is really hard to tariff. But you notice how everyone with influence in the US right now all retail in ideas because the people who work for a living who are about creating things are the ones who are going to be affected the most by this. And yet they don't seem to have a voice over at the Oval Office in this particular regime. Now, of course, I have my own criticisms towards the Canadians' response. Uh, Daniel Smith been doing nothing but bootlicking, very clearly a traitor, and makes me ashamed to call myself Albertan. The rest of the country, all of our leaders have stepped up and at least finally appear to be getting along over the common enemy aspect of things. The problem I have is the call out to impose more tariffs. Even though, yes, it will hurt the US economy as much as the US economy is going to be hurting us with their tariffs. Tariffs do not work, as I said before. They make everybody more poor. So the question is can us Canadians endure a trade war with tariffs going through the roof? Can we anticipate, expect, and endure the cost of living increases that will come from these things? Now, the question is who's going to break first? Now, since a large number of the lumber industry in the US is supplied by Canada, at least we'll have all the homes being built because we don't need to ship them our wood. We can just build it ourselves. So the housing crisis might actually get resolved in the simple fact that we're not going to be selling it in to any Americans. We might as well use it for ourselves. The thing is, why are we continuing to trade with governments like this when you have a government elected like the Trump administration? You would think that the first steps would be how do we find other countries to start negotiating logistics with so that we could start mass producing and shipping out to far more profitable, reasonable, and trustworthy nations. And this is one of those things is the American foreign policy always flip-flops. It's very inconsistent. And so the tariffs are just another example of that inconsistency on how they don't respect anyone who's not them. And I don't mean Americans as a whole. I mean the American government. I mean the way the American government treats the world. Because for the most part, where we're born doesn't necessarily dictate whether you're a good or a bad person, but how your country is being run seems to have a level of consistency that if people would just make a couple of changes, so much could be better for everybody. The power move to try and force Canada in submission in order to achieve what, this 51st state? Or is this all just a slide, like, a silly little magic trick? We keep looking at the flash in the pan. And even I admit I'm distracted by the flash. I have yet to discern exactly what the real motives that's happening here. And if you could explain or give me some relevant idea as to the reality of why we're having to endure this absolute ludicrous display of actual bullying on a global scale, I really hope to hear from you in the comments below, because I am lost, which doesn't happen very often. It comes down is Canadians are going to end up becoming the most Canadian you'll ever see us. We will be buying Canadian, we will be trading Canadian, and fairly soon you will see how Canadian a Canadian can get. I half expect us to be wearing blue jean tuxedos and flannel over the next few years as just a simple icon of saying Canada first, baby. Canadian identity is something that everybody's always said, well, what identifies a Canadian? And I've always felt personally that the true identification of a Canadian is we're nice until you make it so we don't want to be. So Trump can continue his threats, continue his little games. Clearly, we follow through on ours since he backed away from his. As of today, the extension of 30 days has been attached to the tariff threat simply because Canada's response of even more tariffs seemed to have him shaking in his booties a little bit. And yeah, I'm going to provoke the monster a little bit. I'm going to poke the bear. I dare him to try again. Because the reality is, Trump can't win because we're not scared of him. I think next week would be a great time for me to say what I personally feel would be a great example of how we can overcome the issues that led us to this today. So next week's episode, if you decide to tune forward, I'm going to be covering my opinions pertaining to how we could attempt to resolve the inflation issues that on a global scale has us all flip-flopping governments simply because we're looking for change, but not sure which change is going to correct the problem. Thank you very much. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for listening, and join us next time on the Not-Quite Humanoid Typhoon.